Enjoying the $5,000 a month, Mom? My son Daniel asked as he wrapped his arms around me beside the enormous Christmas tree, his voice cheerful, proud, and completely unaware that his simple question was about to unravel something none of us were prepared for. For a moment, I just stood there in the middle of his living room, surrounded by warm golden lights, soft jazz music drifting from hidden speakers, and the laughter of guests holding crystal glasses of champagne. Daniel's house was enormous. Nearly 8,000 square feet of polished hardwood floors and tall windows looking out over the snow-covered hills outside Denver. The Christmas tree alone must have been 12 feet tall, decorated with white lights and delicate glass ornaments that probably cost more than the monthly grocery bill I carefully calculated back home in Ohio. Daniel hugged me tightly, the way he used to when he was a boy, and everyone nearby smiled at the sweet moment between a successful son and his aging mother. But inside my chest something cold and heavy began to settle, because I had no idea what he was talking about. $5,000 a month. I hadn't received $5,000 from anyone in my life. Not once, not even when my husband was still alive. My pension barely covered my utilities and the property taxes on the small ranch house I'd lived in for nearly 40 years. Most months I stretched every dollar, buying generic brands, and keeping the thermostat low during winter so my heating bill wouldn't climb too high. Just last month I'd stood in the pharmacy aisle debating whether to refill all my prescriptions at once or wait another 2 weeks. And yet here was my son, smiling warmly, clearly believing he had been supporting me generously for quite some time. I pulled back from the hug slowly, trying to keep my expression calm. Daniel looked exactly like his father had at that age, tall, confident, the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately became the center of attention. He had built a technology company from a small startup into something that now employed hundreds of people. Magazines had written about him. Business podcasts invited him as a guest. I was proud of him in a quiet, distant way, the way mothers often are when their children grow into lives much larger than their own. But now I searched his face carefully. "What money, Daniel?" I asked gently. At first he thought I was joking. He laughed and glanced around, as if expecting someone else to join in. "The transfers," he said. $5,000 every month. I've been sending it for 2 years. 2 years. The number echoed in my mind like a hollow knock against wood. 2 years ago was around the time Daniel had insisted on helping me update some of my banking paperwork after my husband passed away. I remembered sitting at my kitchen table while his wife Vanessa typed things into her laptop, smiling politely and telling me she'd make everything simpler so I wouldn't have to worry about online accounts. Across the room now, Vanessa stood near the fireplace speaking with a pair of Daniel's business partners. She wore a cream-colored dress that probably came from a boutique I'd never even heard of. Her hair was styled perfectly, her smile elegant and controlled. But when our eyes met for the briefest second, something flickered across her face. It was small, so small most people would have missed it entirely. A tightness, a pause, as if she suddenly realized the conversation she feared most had finally begun. Daniel was still smiling, completely relaxed. He clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You deserve it, Mom," he said. "After everything you did for me growing up." I nodded slowly, pretending to absorb his kindness while my thoughts raced quietly behind my calm expression. Because the truth was simple and undeniable. If Daniel had really been sending $5,000 every month for 2 years, that meant somewhere out there existed $120,000 that had never reached me. And at that moment, standing beneath a glowing Christmas tree in a house filled with laughter and music, I realized this holiday gathering might not end the way anyone expected. I did not confront Daniel that night. I did not accuse anyone, and I did not raise my voice. Instead, I smiled softly the way mothers often do when they do not want to ruin a happy moment. The music continued to drift through the living room. Guests laughed near the kitchen island, and the scent of cinnamon and roasted turkey filled the air. Daniel was quickly pulled away by a group of investors who wanted to congratulate him on a recent business deal, leaving me standing quietly beside the Christmas tree with a glass of sparkling water in my hand. I watched him from across the room as he spoke confidently, gesturing with the natural ease of a man who had spent years leading meetings and making decisions worth millions of dollars. He looked successful, powerful, completely certain about the world around him. And in that moment I realized something that made my chest tighten. My son truly believed he had been helping me. That meant the money had not simply disappeared. It had been going somewhere. I turned my head slightly and looked toward Vanessa again. She was now standing near the large stone fireplace, laughing politely at something one of Daniel's colleagues had said. Her posture was elegant, her smile controlled, but her eyes flicked toward me more than once. Each time she quickly looked away again. It was the behavior of someone trying to appear calm while quietly measuring how much another person might know. 2 years ago, a memory slowly returned to me with surprising clarity. It was late spring back then, only a few months after my husband Harold passed away. The house had felt painfully quiet without him. One afternoon, Daniel and Vanessa had visited to help me organize some paperwork. Daniel had been busy taking phone calls in the living room, while Vanessa sat beside me at the kitchen table with her laptop open. She spoke gently, almost kindly. She told me modern banking could be confusing and that she would help simplify things so Daniel could easily support me if I ever needed help. At the time, I had been grateful. I trusted her completely. She asked for my bank statements and typed several numbers into the computer while explaining things in a calm, reassuring voice. I remember signing a few documents that she printed for me, believing they were simply updates for online access. I had not thought about that afternoon again until this moment. Now the memory felt different, colder somehow. I set my glass down on a small side table and walked slowly toward one of the tall windows overlooking Daniel's snowy backyard. Outside, the yard lights illuminated a thin layer of fresh snow that had fallen earlier that evening. The scene looked peaceful, quiet, almost perfect. Inside the house, the party continued, but my thoughts were far away in my small kitchen back in Ohio, where I had carefully balanced my checkbook month after month, wondering why my savings never seemed to stretch as far as they once had. The heating bill last January had nearly forced me to cancel a doctor appointment. I had sold an old gold bracelet during the summer to cover a property tax increase. All the while, my son believed he had been sending me $5,000 every single month. I felt a strange calm settle over me as the pieces slowly began arranging themselves into a clearer picture. Daniel had said the transfers began 2 years ago. That meant 24 payments. $120,000. I did not know exactly where that money had gone, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. If Daniel believed I had been receiving it, someone must have created a system convincing him everything was working exactly as planned. I glanced back toward the fireplace. Vanessa was no longer laughing. She was watching me again, this time more carefully. For a moment, neither of us moved. The distance between us was only about 20 feet across the polished floor, but the silence between our eyes felt much longer. She gave a small, polite smile as if nothing at all had changed. I returned the smile just as gently, because the truth was I had already made a decision. I was not going to ruin Christmas. Not tonight. But the quiet question that Daniel had asked beside that glowing tree had opened a door that could not be closed again. And sooner or later we were all going to have to walk through it. I spent the rest of the evening pretending nothing had changed, which turned out to be surprisingly easy after 71 years of learning how to keep my thoughts to myself. Mothers develop that skill early. We learn how to smile when we are worried, how to listen when something feels wrong, and how to wait patiently until the right moment arrives. The party continued well past 9 o'clock. More guests arrived. Coats were placed neatly along the long hallway bench, and Daniel's living room slowly filled with cheerful conversation. Someone turned on a classic Christmas playlist, and soon the soft sound of Nat King Cole singing about chestnuts roasting filled the house. I sat quietly in a comfortable armchair near the edge of the room and watched everything the way I used to watch Daniel play baseball when he was a boy. Back then, I would sit in the metal bleachers with a cup of coffee and observe every detail of the field while other parents chatted. I had always been good at noticing things. That evening, the same quiet habit returned. I noticed the way Daniel moved easily through the crowd, greeting people with confident warmth. I noticed how several guests congratulated him on his company's recent expansion. One man mentioned a new office building that was nearly 30,000 square feet. Another spoke about a conference in San Francisco where Daniel had given a presentation. My son had built a life filled with opportunity, something his father and I had once dreamed about for him when we lived in our small Ohio house with the creaky front porch. But as proud as I felt watching him succeed, another thought quietly settled into my mind. If Daniel had truly believed he was sending $5,000 every month, then he must have seen proof somewhere. Successful people do not usually send money for 2 years without checking that it arrives, which meant someone had likely been showing him something that looked like confirmation. I turned my eyes toward Vanessa again. She was speaking with a tall woman near the kitchen counter, her hands resting lightly around a glass of sparkling cider. Her voice sounded relaxed, but there was a small tension in her shoulders now that had not been there earlier. Once or twice she glanced toward Daniel, as if measuring whether he might come back to speak with me again. It was the behavior of someone quietly waiting to see whether a conversation had ended safely or was only beginning. I leaned back slightly in the chair and allowed another memory to surface. 2 summers ago, Daniel had called me one afternoon while I was watering the small tomato plants in my backyard. He had asked if I needed anything, and I told him honestly that I was managing fine. At the time, he sounded pleased, almost relieved. I had assumed he was simply glad to know I was independent. Now that conversation felt different in my mind. If he had already been sending $5,000 every month by then, my answer would have sounded confusing to him, yet he had never questioned it. That meant someone must have reassured him privately afterward. Someone he trusted completely. Across the room, Vanessa finished her conversation and walked slowly toward the dining table where several desserts had been arranged. She picked up a small plate and placed a slice of pumpkin pie on it, but she did not begin eating right away. Instead, she stood there holding the fork in one hand while her eyes drifted briefly in my direction again. When our eyes met this time, she smiled politely, the kind of friendly expression people exchange at gatherings without thinking. I returned the same gentle smile. Because the truth was, I was not angry. Not yet. At that moment, I was still studying the puzzle quietly, allowing the pieces to reveal themselves one by one. Daniel soon returned to sit beside me with 2 cups of hot apple cider, handing one to me with the same warm kindness he had shown all evening. "Are you comfortable, Mom?" he asked. I nodded and thanked him, accepting the cup between my hands as the warmth spread through my fingers. The room was glowing with Christmas lights and laughter, but inside my mind a very different kind of illumination had begun. Somewhere between Daniel's good intentions and my quiet life in Ohio, a story had been written that neither of us fully understood yet. And I had the growing feeling that the person who wrote it was standing only a few steps away. I held the warm cup of apple cider Daniel had given me and watched the golden lights of the Christmas tree shimmer softly across the polished floor, and for a moment the quiet warmth of the room almost made me question my own suspicions. Daniel sat beside me on the sofa, relaxed and smiling, greeting another guest who had just entered the house. He looked proud and content, the way a man does when his life has unfolded exactly the way he hoped it would. It was difficult to imagine that anything dishonest could exist in the middle of such a carefully built world. Yet the thought of that missing money continued to circle slowly in my mind like a quiet echo that refused to fade away. $5,000 a month. 24 months. $120,000. The numbers were simple enough, but the story behind them remained hidden somewhere between Daniel's good intentions and the reality of my life back in Ohio. I lifted the cup and took a small sip, letting the warmth steady my thoughts. Across the room, Vanessa was placing fresh plates of cookies onto the long dining table, moving gracefully between guests and offering polite conversation. Anyone watching her would see nothing unusual. She looked like the perfect host, the kind of woman who could manage a large gathering with effortless charm. But I had lived long enough to understand that appearances rarely tell the full story. Sometimes the most important truths are the ones people work hardest to keep invisible. Daniel leaned back slightly and stretched his arm along the back of the sofa behind me, the same comfortable gesture he used when he visited my house years ago. "You know, Mom," he said cheerfully, "I always worried you might refuse the money at first. That is why Vanessa suggested we set everything up automatically. She said it would make things easier for you." My fingers tightened slightly around the cup, though I kept my face calm. There it was again. Vanessa. Her name placed gently into the explanation as if it belonged there naturally. Daniel spoke without suspicion, the way a man does when he trusts someone completely. I nodded slowly and looked toward the large window where snowflakes had begun falling again outside, drifting quietly through the glow of the backyard lights. "That was thoughtful," I said softly. And in a way it truly had been thoughtful, at least from Daniel's point of view. My son had always been generous. Even when he was young, he would give away his allowance to help a friend buy lunch at school. The idea that he would support me financially never surprised me. What surprised me was the realization that for 2 entire years he believed he already had. Daniel stood up when someone called his name from across the room, promising to return in a moment. As he walked away, I allowed my eyes to follow him briefly before turning once more toward Vanessa. She had finished arranging the desserts and was now speaking with one of Daniel's employees. But something about her posture had changed again. She looked slightly tense, as if she could feel the quiet attention resting on her even from across the room. When our eyes met this time, she hesitated for just a fraction of a second before offering another careful smile. I returned the same polite expression, but inside my thoughts had already begun to move in a new direction. Because Daniel's casual comment had confirmed something important. Vanessa had been involved in setting up the financial arrangement from the beginning. She had helped organize the accounts. She had handled the paperwork. She had been present the afternoon I signed those documents at my kitchen table. Suddenly the memory of that day became much sharper. I could almost see the sunlight coming through the window above my sink, hear the quiet tapping of Vanessa's fingers on the laptop keyboard, and remember the reassuring tone of her voice as she explained that everything would be simpler once the accounts were updated. At the time I had been grieving and tired, grateful for any help that allowed me to avoid dealing with complicated paperwork. Now I realized something I had not considered before. If the money had never reached me, then the system that Vanessa helped create must have directed it somewhere else. I took another calm sip of cider and watched the snow fall steadily outside Daniel's beautiful home. The Christmas party continued around me, full of laughter and glowing lights. But beneath that peaceful scene, a quiet understanding was beginning to form in my mind. The story Daniel believed and the life I had been living could not both be true. And sooner or later the difference between those two realities would have to be explained. I remained seated for several more minutes, listening to the quiet rhythm of conversation filling the room while my thoughts continued to move carefully through the pieces of this strange puzzle. The Christmas lights reflected softly on the windows, and the scent of fresh pine from the enormous tree drifted through the air. Anyone looking at me would have seen nothing more than a content older woman enjoying a holiday evening with her son. That was the advantage of age. People often assumed we were peaceful simply because we were quiet. In truth, quiet minds can notice far more than loud ones. Across the room, Daniel was laughing with two men near the kitchen island, explaining something about a new office opening in Seattle. His confidence was natural, the result of years spent building a company that had grown far beyond anything his father and I had once imagined. I felt the same pride I had always felt when watching him succeed. But that pride now carried a small shadow of concern. If Daniel believed he had been supporting me all this time, then discovering the truth would not only reveal missing money, it would also reveal that someone he trusted deeply had not been honest with him. I did not want that moment to happen in the middle of a Christmas party surrounded by guests and glowing decorations. Some conversations deserve privacy. Vanessa moved slowly around the room, refilling glasses and speaking politely with everyone who approached her. Yet every so often her eyes drifted toward me again. It was subtle enough that most people would never notice it, but I noticed it every time. The careful glance, the quick look away, the small pause in her movements whenever Daniel came near me. That kind of attention usually means only one thing. A person is wondering how much another person knows. I lifted my cup of cider again, even though it had already cooled, and pretended to watch the snow falling outside the tall windows. Inside my mind, another memory surfaced, this one clearer than the others. It happened about a year ago when Vanessa had called me unexpectedly on a Tuesday afternoon. She spoke kindly, asking how I was managing the house and whether my bills were becoming difficult. At the time, I told her honestly that things were a little tight, but still manageable. She responded in a calm, reassuring voice, telling me Daniel had already arranged support for me and that everything should be appearing in my account regularly. I remember feeling confused by that statement back then. I had checked my account later that evening and found nothing unusual, but I assumed perhaps she meant something that had not started yet. I did not want to bother Daniel with questions about money, so I simply let the matter fade away. Now that brief conversation returned with a completely different meaning. Vanessa had believed the money was already reaching me, or perhaps she wanted me to believe that she believed it was. I set the empty cup down beside the chair and slowly stood up, stretching my legs as though I simply wanted to walk around the room. In reality, I wanted a closer look at something. Near the dining table, a stack of holiday cards rested beside a small decorative box where guests had placed gifts for Daniel and Vanessa. As I walked past, I noticed Vanessa standing only a few feet away, arranging napkins beside the dessert plates. She glanced up as I approached. For a brief moment, we stood side by side without speaking. Her perfume carried a faint scent of vanilla and winter spice. "Everything looks beautiful tonight," I said gently. Vanessa smiled with polite confidence. "Daniel worked very hard this year," she replied. "He wanted Christmas to feel special." I nodded slowly and looked toward the glowing tree in the living room, where Daniel was now greeting another group of guests who had just arrived. "He has always been generous," I said quietly. Vanessa's smile held steady, but something in her eyes shifted again, almost like a door closing softly behind a thought she did not want anyone else to see. In that moment, my suspicions settled into something calmer and clearer. I still did not know exactly where the money had gone, but I was now certain about one important detail. The explanation was connected to Vanessa, and sooner or later the truth would come out, whether anyone at this party was ready for it or not. I stepped away from the dining table and slowly walked toward the hallway that led to the back patio doors, giving the appearance of someone simply stretching their legs after sitting too long. The party behind me continued with cheerful energy. Someone had begun telling a story near the kitchen, and laughter rippled across the room. The music shifted to another familiar Christmas song, soft and nostalgic, the kind that always reminded me of the years when Daniel was small, and our home was filled with simple decorations and homemade cookies instead of crystal glasses and catered desserts. Those memories were not painful. In fact, they made me smile. Daniel had always been a thoughtful boy. Even when he was 8 years old, he once saved his allowance for 3 weeks just to buy me a small potted plant from the local garden center because he knew I loved flowers. That kindness had not disappeared. I had seen it clearly in his face earlier when he hugged me and asked if the money had been helping. He truly believed he had been caring for me, which meant someone else had been shaping that belief quietly behind the scenes. I paused near the large patio window and looked out across the backyard where snow had begun collecting on the stone path that led to the garden. The outdoor lights cast a warm glow across the white surface, making the snowfall look almost peaceful. My reflection in the glass looked calm and composed, though inside my thoughts were moving steadily toward a decision. I did not need to accuse anyone tonight. I did not need to argue or demand answers in front of Daniel's guests. Time often reveals the truth more effectively than confrontation. Still, there was one simple step I could take before the evening ended. I turned back toward the living room just as Daniel finished speaking with a group of friends near the fireplace. He spotted me immediately and walked over with his easy, confident stride. "Mom, are you doing all right?" he asked kindly. "Do you need anything?" I shook my head gently and placed a hand on his arm the way I used to when he was younger. "Everything is lovely, Daniel," I said. "Your home is beautiful." His smile widened with the familiar warmth that always made him look like the boy I remembered. For a moment, we stood quietly together while the lights from the tree shimmered behind him. Then I spoke again in the calmest voice I could manage. "You mentioned earlier that the transfers were automatic," I said. "Do you happen to remember which bank account you used?" Daniel did not hesitate for even a second. "Of course," he said easily. "It is the same account Vanessa helped set up for you 2 years ago. The one connected to your online banking." My heart remained steady, though the confirmation settled firmly into place inside my thoughts. Vanessa had not simply been present during that paperwork. She had helped create the account Daniel believed belonged to me. "That is very thoughtful," I replied gently. "I should probably review everything again when I get home. I may have overlooked something." Daniel nodded immediately, completely supportive. "If anything looks confusing, just call me," he said. "Or Vanessa can help you log in again. She handled most of the setup." Across the room, Vanessa was speaking with another guest, but the moment Daniel mentioned her name, she glanced over in our direction as though she had been listening for it. Our eyes met briefly once more. This time her smile appeared a fraction slower than before. Only a second perhaps, but long enough to confirm what I had already begun to understand. The system Daniel trusted so completely had not been built by him. It had been built by someone standing only a few steps away. I placed my hand gently on Daniel's shoulder and thanked him again for the evening, letting the conversation move on to lighter topics as another group of guests approached. But as the music continued and the Christmas lights shimmered softly around the room, one quiet realization remained perfectly clear in my mind. When I returned home to Ohio after the holiday, the very first thing I would do was open that bank account myself. And when I did, the truth about those missing 2 years would finally begin to reveal itself. I did not speak about the money again that night. The Christmas party slowly moved toward its final hours, and one by one the guests began gathering their coats from the long bench near the front door. The house gradually became quieter as the laughter faded and the music lowered to a soft background melody. Daniel walked each guest to the entrance with the natural hospitality he had learned from his father. Vanessa stood beside him, thanking everyone for coming, her smile steady and gracious as always. Anyone watching them would have seen a perfect couple ending a perfect holiday evening. I remained near the living room window, observing the final moments of the gathering with the same calm patience that had carried me through many difficult seasons of life. Years teach a person that answers often arrive when we stop chasing them and simply allow time to reveal what it already knows. By 10:30 most of the guests had left. The enormous house felt different without the noise of conversation filling every corner. Only the Christmas lights and the faint scent of pine from the tree remained. Daniel returned to the living room, carrying 2 empty glasses, and set them gently on the coffee table. "That was a good night," he said with satisfaction as he sat down in the armchair across from me. "I am really glad you came out here, Mom." His voice carried the warm sincerity that had always been part of his character. I smiled and nodded. "I would not miss Christmas with my son," I replied softly. Vanessa joined us a moment later after locking the front door. She walked into the room with measured calm and took a seat on the sofa beside Daniel. For a brief moment the three of us sat quietly beneath the glow of the tree lights, the room peaceful and still after the busy evening. Daniel leaned forward slightly and rested his elbows on his knees. "You should stay a few extra days," he said. "The guest room is ready, and it will give us time to relax together before you head back to Ohio." The offer was generous, and part of me wanted to accept simply to enjoy the comfort of being near my son. But another part of me knew that the questions forming in my mind needed space to be answered carefully. "That is very kind," I said gently. "But I promised my neighbor I would check on her houseplants when she returns from visiting her daughter. I should probably head home tomorrow morning." Daniel nodded with understanding. He had always respected my independence. Vanessa remained quiet beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The room was calm enough now that the smallest movements became noticeable. I saw the way her fingers tightened slightly when Daniel spoke about the bank account earlier in the evening. I saw the quick glance she gave him as if measuring whether the conversation might return to that topic again. She had recovered her composure well, but the tension had never fully left her posture. After a few minutes, Daniel stood up and stretched his arms. "I should start cleaning up a little before we all go to bed," he said. "Mom, you look tired. The guest room is upstairs whenever you are ready." I thanked him and slowly rose from my chair. Vanessa stood as well, offering a polite smile. "Let me know if you need anything," she said in her usual smooth voice. I returned the smile with the same calm courtesy. "Everything has been wonderful," I replied. Daniel walked toward the kitchen to gather the remaining dishes, leaving Vanessa and me alone in the living room for the first time that evening. The silence between us lasted only a few seconds, but it carried a quiet weight that had not been present earlier. Vanessa adjusted one of the ornaments on the Christmas tree as if straightening a small detail that needed attention. Then she turned slightly toward me. "I hope you enjoyed the party," she said. Her voice remained pleasant, but there was a carefulness behind the words now. I looked at the glowing lights reflecting across the polished floor and answered honestly. "It was a beautiful evening." Then I met her eyes gently. "And I am very grateful for the help you gave me with my banking a couple of years ago. I think I will take another look at those accounts when I get home." Vanessa held my gaze for a brief moment. Her smile remained polite, but the quiet confidence behind it seemed to shift ever so slightly. It was the smallest reaction, almost invisible. But after 71 years of watching people closely, I recognized it immediately. It was the look of someone who suddenly realized that a story she believed was safely buried might soon begin to surface again. I woke early the next morning before the rest of the house had stirred, the quiet, unfamiliar stillness of Daniel's enormous home reminding me how different his life had become from the small house I kept in Ohio. The guest room window overlooked the backyard, and overnight the snowfall had covered the garden path completely, leaving a smooth blanket of white stretching across the yard. For a few moments, I simply sat on the edge of the bed watching the pale winter sunlight slowly brighten the horizon. It felt peaceful, almost comforting, but the calm of the morning did not change the questions that had followed me through the night. The thought of those missing transfers had settled firmly into my mind now, no longer a vague suspicion, but something clearer and more certain. Somewhere over the past 2 years a quiet arrangement had been created, and it was time for me to see exactly how that arrangement had been built. I dressed slowly and made my way downstairs, careful not to disturb anyone. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Daniel and Vanessa were still asleep. I poured myself a small cup of coffee and sat at the long kitchen island where the remains of the Christmas party had been neatly cleaned away. Everything looked perfectly organized again, as if the evening's celebration had never happened at all. I took a sip of coffee and reached into my purse for my phone. Daniel had mentioned that the account connected to the transfers was tied to my online banking profile, the one Vanessa had helped me establish 2 years earlier. At the time, I had never bothered using it because I preferred visiting the bank in person when I needed to check anything. Technology had never been something I relied on, but that morning I decided it was finally time to open that door. It took me a few minutes to locate the login information Vanessa had once written down for me on a small card that I had kept tucked inside my checkbook. I entered the username slowly, then the password beneath it, watching the screen carefully as the account began to load. The bank's homepage appeared first, simple and professional, displaying my name in the upper corner. Margaret Whitmore. That part was correct. I tapped the section labeled Account Summary and waited. The information refreshed on the screen. For a moment, nothing seemed unusual. The checking balance looked exactly the way I expected it to look, modest and steady, reflecting the same careful budgeting I had been maintaining for years. But beneath that account, another line appeared that I did not recognize. A second account labeled Trust Management Account. I frowned slightly and tapped the line to open it. The screen changed, revealing a list of recent transactions that immediately made my heart pause for a brief moment. Each month, a deposit appeared with the same description, scheduled transfer. The amount was always the same, $5,000. I scrolled downward slowly, watching the pattern continue again and again, month after month, exactly as Daniel had described the night before. The transfers were real. They had been happening exactly as he believed. But what caught my attention was not the deposits themselves. It was the line that appeared directly beneath each one. Withdrawal transfer. $5,000. The same amount, the same day. My fingers remained perfectly still as I stared at the repeating pattern. Deposit. Withdrawal. Deposit. Withdrawal. 24 times in a row. 2 full years of money entering the account and leaving again almost immediately. I continued scrolling until I reached the account details section at the bottom of the page. There, in small official text, the account listed 2 authorized managers. The first name was mine, Margaret Whitmore. The second name appeared just beneath it, Vanessa Whitmore. I set the phone down gently on the kitchen counter and folded my hands together, allowing the quiet morning light to settle across the room. The mystery Daniel had unknowingly revealed the night before was no longer a mystery. The money had never vanished at all. It had simply been redirected by someone who believed I would never look closely enough to notice. I remained seated at the kitchen island for several quiet minutes, allowing the information on the phone screen to settle fully into my understanding before I touched anything again. Outside the tall windows, the winter morning had grown brighter, and the snow in the backyard reflected the sunlight in soft silver patterns across the kitchen floor. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful for the realization that had just unfolded in front of me. The transfers had been real exactly as Daniel believed. Every month for 2 years, he had sent $5,000, believing he was helping his mother live comfortably in Ohio. Yet every deposit had been followed by a withdrawal on the same day, as precise and consistent as the ticking of a clock. 24 deposits, 24 withdrawals. The numbers did not lie. I picked up the phone again and reviewed the account details slowly, making sure I had not misunderstood what I was seeing. The account name was correct. The transfers were legitimate. And the list of authorized managers clearly showed 2 names. My own name and Vanessa Whitmore. That detail alone explained more than enough. I did not feel anger in that moment. What I felt instead was a quiet clarity that comes when a confusing situation finally reveals its shape. The story Daniel believed had been carefully constructed. He had been told the money was supporting me. I had been told nothing at all. And in between those two realities, someone had quietly redirected $120,000 without either of us fully realizing what had happened. I set the phone down again just as I heard footsteps on the staircase behind me. Daniel entered the kitchen still wearing a soft gray sweater, his hair slightly messy from sleep. He smiled when he saw me sitting there with a cup of coffee. "You are up early," he said warmly as he walked toward the refrigerator. I returned his smile with the same calm expression I had worn throughout the evening before. "Old habits," I replied gently. "I have always liked quiet mornings." Daniel poured himself a glass of orange juice and sat down across from me at the island. The morning sunlight illuminated his face clearly now, and for a moment I saw the same boy who used to sit at our kitchen table in Ohio asking for pancakes before school. I knew then that whatever happened next would not change the love I felt for him. But honesty was something every family deserves, even when it arrives unexpectedly. I reached over and turned the phone screen toward him. "Daniel," I said softly, "you were right about the transfers." He leaned forward slightly, curious. "Of course," he replied with easy confidence. "I told you everything was automatic." I nodded and allowed him to look at the transaction history displayed on the screen. At first he seemed pleased to see the deposits listed month after month exactly as he expected. But then his eyes moved to the second line beneath each one. The withdrawals. His expression changed slowly as the pattern revealed itself. He leaned closer to the screen, reading carefully. Deposit. Withdrawal. Deposit. Withdrawal. 24 times in a row. For several seconds Daniel said nothing at all. Finally, he looked up at me with quiet confusion. "I do not understand," he said. I met his eyes calmly and turned the screen slightly to show the account details where the authorized managers were listed. Daniel followed the movement and read the names silently. Margaret Whitmore. Vanessa Whitmore. The kitchen remained silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of water running upstairs where Vanessa had likely begun her morning routine. Daniel sat back slowly in his chair, processing the realization that had suddenly entered the room between us. I did not raise my voice or make accusations. I simply folded my hands on the table and waited. Because sometimes the truth does not need to be explained. It only needs to be seen.